Michael, good to see you after all this time.
Good to see you, Robyn.
About one of my favourite people in Australian history, Mark Oliphant. And would you remind us, what sort of scientific research was he famous for?
Well, he was particularly famous for his work in nuclear physics. And it was early in the days, really, of nuclear physics being treated as a discipline in the sciences. And in fact, his supervisor was previously known as a chemist, because really physics didn't exist.
Yes, indeed. Ernest Rutherford.
That's right.
Yes, he got a Nobel Prize in chemistry, and he was so cross because it was physics that he did. Father of the nucleus, really. And your grandfather, Mark Oliphant, was called his right-hand man because Ernest Rutherford was a bit clumsy, so Mark was good at experimentation.
That's right, and also good at managing Ernest Rutherford's notable temper and keeping him focused on the things that he should have been spending his time on, and not so much on management issues.
A New Zealander and an Australian over there in Cambridge. How did Mark get on with Cambridge, which can have its pomposities occasionally?
Well, I think he enjoyed being an Antipodean, upsetting some of the traditions and the aloofness of Cambridge, but the truth is he also loved it as an academic atmosphere, the atmosphere of learning, but also in terms of culture and the arts. He was a great follower of music. He had been an organ student as a child and a chorister before his hearing trouble got in the way. So it would be fair to say that he enjoyed everything that Cambridge had to offer, and it always had a very special place in his heart long after he left.
Indeed. He came back to Australia, which was very interesting, because he could have stayed there indefinitely. Why did he come back?
He came back, and lots of people have commented that he really put a torpedo through a very promising and well-remunerated research career by coming back to Australia. But he felt that studying science and doing scientific research at a world-class level was an important capability that Australia needed to develop. And he felt in arguing for the establishment of the Australian National University as a principal research university, that was the best contribution he could make to his country and his nation. And again, contrary to what some say, he never regretted that. He understood what he was giving up. He understood the sacrifice he was making. But until the day he died, in conversations with me, he was proudest of what he did in establishing the research school here at the ANU, and his role in establishing the university more generally as a world-class institution.
Let me just quote to reinforce what you just said and illustrate his idealism. He said, "I have a deep confidence in the part which science can play in making us strong and prosperous." He's talking about Australia, of course. "And an idea that the proper use of science within its diverse territories may point the way to a secure and good life for all, for the community." The idealism is so strong.
Indeed, the community and the population of the world. And when you think about some of the scientific discoveries he'd been involved with in particle physics, in terms of the team at the Cavendish laboratories at Cambridge that split the atom, his work later on microwave radar at the University of Birmingham, and his work on putting atomic physics into play to, as they felt at the time, win victory in the Second World War. His view of science and learning was fundamentally connected to his view of the well-being of humanity and the advancement of humanity in all fields.
There's one paradox, though. he, very peaceful man, as you implied, and I read that quotation, idealistic. And yet he was the one who recognised the problem of the bomb and that the Germans might get it. And he famously, although not in the movie, recently,
not in the movie,
took the letter to America that made the Manhattan Project happen. You know, was he always happy about having done that, or was he conflicted?
So, yes, you make reference to Oppenheimer, the movie, and if you watch the movie, the story, really starts with Ernest Lawrence at Berkeley University in California. And it is true, my grandfather was the one who saw Lawrence as the one who would have the vision but also the political nous to sell the idea of developing the atomic bomb to the Americans, which was the only Allied power that had the finances and scientific capability to carry it off. It was quite clear to everyone. To answer your question, yes, he was conflicted about it, but what he would always say was, what you need to understand is we were in a real war of survival against an ideology manifest in the Nazi regime and Adolf Hitler in Germany. And while we understood, at least at a theoretical level, the sort of terror and sort of change to world history that the use of such a weapon would imply, it was so much more important to beat this this evil regime. And if they had come out of World War II victorious, we'd all be living different lives.
Yes.
And that's what he liked to remind people. But in terms of his part in bringing on the immediate destruction that was wrought by the use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he felt incredibly guilty about that at a human level. And he never balanced, at least in conversations with me, the point of the need to beat Hitler with the humanitarian impact of the bomb. He never tried to justify it that way. The two realities existed in parallel.
Yeah. Well, of course, we're here to celebrate the formation of the Academy of Science just over 70 years ago, and he was playing such a big part in that move, which they'd tried to establish in 1901, a long time ago. What did Mark manage to do that no one else could seem to bring off?
I think there are several parts to that, but perhaps the most important one, remembering that Mark was one of the youngest members, one of the youngest fellows of the Royal Society of London that there had ever been, and understood with the colleagues that he mixed with at the height of his postgraduate and research career, that the Royal Society played a fundamental role in connecting people and bringing the importance of scientific research to light and to the public consciousness.
So he saw an example that he wanted to follow.
He saw an example that he wanted to follow, and he didn't think the answer was to nominate Australians to be Fellows of the Royal Society in London. He wanted an Australian institution which would herald our excellence and which would provide a home, as this place does, for all of those high-level, world-level discussions and debates. That's why he felt it was important.
And of course there's a revolution with Macfarlane Burnet and even Eccles to do work here in Australia rather than go overseas and do your spell and then come back when you're old and grey.
That's right.
So when the Academy was set up, of course, the Shine Dome was being built, this extraordinary structure. What did Mark say about the design?
Yeah, so the establishment of the main academy building and what we now call the Shine Dome, that was absolutely something that Mark was proud of. As most people know, it was quite a controversial design in its time, notwithstanding that Canberra was still developing architecturally, and many of the national institutions we know in the parliamentary triangle today weren't there when the Shine Dome was originally built. But he was tremendously proud of it, and he saw, I think, the controversy associated with its design as a bit of a wake-up call, which helped him with his narrative about why things were important.
Yes, Australia's got its own flying saucer.
Australia's got its own flying saucer.
Middle of town.
And we've dared to do something different. We've dared to be experimental. And we're happy to be proud of it.
And the Academy has this wonderful library, but he was strongly involved. In what way?
He was very insistent that part of the Academy's offering and part of the Academy's importance as an institution would rely on the information that it held, including about the development of the Academy itself as it went through the decades. So he personally insisted that the design of the building and the budget for running the Academy included strong allowances for a proper library and conservation and librarians to manage a growing collection. And it's probably no accident that his daughter, my mother, was a librarian by profession for her entire career. So she was probably whispering in his ear.
Another talent that he had apart from initiating this, and that was to maintain the friendly collegial discussions that make an academy thrive. You know, because even the Royal Society can occasionally be, rumbustious, but that collegial, what was his secret?
I think it was really his interpersonal skills. No one who ever worked with Mark or alongside Mark or even on the work that Mark left behind would say that he was a gifted administrator or a gifted bureaucrat or a gifted technocrat. He was none of those things. He was obviously highly intelligent, but he was highly emotional as well, prone to outbursts of glee as well as outbursts of anger when things were either going the way he thought they should or the way he thought they shouldn't. But he didn't
use them to manipulate.
No, he didn't. He wasn't personal at that level. Both his passions and frustrations were always about the issue, not about the personalities. And Mark never resisted and in fact encouraged contestability of ideas. He thought that was a fundamentally important principle of exploration, including scientific exploration. And because he had quite a disarming manner and he would probably be surprised to hear me say, quite a good toolkit, interpersonal toolkit, to get people to work well alongside each other. He was able to foster a collegial atmosphere for quite robust debates without it getting personal. And he tended not to get personal with anyone himself.
Sounds as if you had a good time growing up with him.
I had a tremendous time growing up with him. It was a great privilege. He lived till 98, so he didn't die until I was 29. I knew him well as an adult as well as a child. I remember my times visiting him and my grandmother at Government House, but from 1986 he came back to Canberra to live in a self-contained unit behind my mother's house in Griffith, and that allowed him to come back to the ANU and spend a lot of time here. The ANU maintained his office and access to all resources, and he was involved in guiding research well into his 80s, but a man of tremendously diverse interests and great deep curiosity, particularly about the things that he didn't think he understood well, and that included areas of the social sciences which he found often baffling, but was quite keen to have dialogue about and learn more about and change his view on and admit error He was very upfront about that. He did have an ego, but his ability to admit error and change his mind were, I think, as fresh in his late 90s as they should have been in his early 20s when you were still formulating your view of the world.
So Mark Oliphant came back to Australia, but he did stay in touch with the international world?
Indeed he did. He felt that was fundamentally important to the scientific endeavour. No one institution, no one researcher, no one group could be the answer on their own to any large scientific challenge. And when you think about the group of scientists that Rutherford gathered at the Cavendish Labs in Cambridge in the 1920s and 1930s, you would be hard-pressed to find a more multinational crew of high-level, mid-career researchers in any field of study, probably still in history. And this went very much to Mark's early experience and makeup and the values that he expounded afterwards in bringing everyone who had the ability to contribute to research and to answering a scientific dilemma to the table. So he made sure he kept in touch with all of his networks and constantly sought to extend them, including in places where he hadn't worked and with scientists with whom he hadn't worked, including in China, well before Australia re-established diplomatic relations under the Whitlam government. He felt that was fundamental to humanity moving forward and avoiding secrecy and suspicion, making the products of scientific endeavour widely available for people to take advantage of and take further, rather than keep it under wraps where no one could access it and no one could add to it.
Mm. And science has become worldwide just about the most international human activity, more than sport, which is something that doesn't last forever and which is very, very competitive. But, this cooperation is fundamental. Collaboration is the name of science, and it has to be done internationally.
It has to be. And as I said, no one team or institution has all of the answers to the big questions. So imagine trying to tackle climate change if the international community had decided only one university in the United States should work on it. That would be ridiculous. It's a perfect example of where international cooperation is not only a good thing, but fundamental to solving some of the large dilemmas. And it tends to be the way scientists think too. They learn and have developed as individuals out of what they've learnt from others. It's just a way of being.
What do you think he would make of the work of the Academy were he able to comment today?
He'd certainly have views. I think he would hope that the Academy would continue to develop its profile, develop its ability to broker important discussions, and further develop its ability to, in a non-threatening way, perhaps, provide a platform for a reasoned debate or reasoned debates on where the country should go and where the globe should go on some difficult and controversial issues. He certainly had a very strong interest in the science of climate change in probably the last 3 decades of his life.
Already?
Yes, absolutely. He was one of the people in the late 70s and early 1980s who were starting to talk about climate change research that was coming out of other disciplines than those he was familiar with, but really becoming alarmed about what the science was telling us and indicating the world needed to do in a cooperative fashion to address such an existential threat. And I think he would hope that the role of the Academy was one where you could bring minds together that didn't necessarily agree, but could have a sensible debate, but also take the applied research discussion forward to help decision makers really land on what they needed to do next, rather than endless discussions on the same material with new research inputs coming in along the way. He was a great believer in applied research and the link between science and decision making and the allocation of resources to make the world a better place.
Indeed. Well, the ambition was there, but many of us feel these days that the world is something of a turbulent mess. And would that really have upset him so he'd want to, pack it up and give it away? Was he a fighter?
He was never someone who would pack up and give it away. He was always a fighter, but he could get tremendously depressed about some of the challenges. And in his later years, including in the area of climate change, but other areas of endeavour where the evidence almost incontrovertibly should lead decision makers in a particular direction, and decision makers didn't seem to have the will or the nous to move in that direction, it would make him depressed and angry. So he tried very hard, I think, in all areas of his life and his social and political engagement to remain an optimist, but he was pessimistic about some of those issues in the last decades.
Yes, I have the feeling, those sort of discussions I had with him, always idealistic, always wanting to make a difference, but then the slump, and you think, oh dear. What about his own research? Did that continue in a reasonable way?
It continued to a level in certain areas, I think, into the 1980s, but particularly when he was back in Canberra and back engaged with the life of the ANU and the Academy on more of a sort of week-by-week and day-to-day basis sometimes, I think he saw his greater contribution being to help mentor younger researchers and even mid-level and high-level researchers and administrators to make the system work better and more efficiently. And I think he even used some of the mistakes he'd made as an administrator.
As a human being.
And as a human being, of course.
He was such a human being.
He was. A great human with great humanity, and being a human being and a good human being would be the thing he, I think, would have hoped was his greatest testament. But to try and give people who were the answer in whatever way to making these institutions stronger and more effective and more relevant, giving strength to their arm, that's, I think, where he really focused in the last 15 years or so.
And did he really cut his ties with Adelaide? Because I saw him often in Adelaide, and we often asked, what is there so special in Adelaide producing all these Nobel Prize? He didn't get a Nobel Prize, but he could have. But that amazing creativity in science that came out of that small town. How come?
That's right. It's an interesting question which I think he never had the answer to. His answer certainly wasn't because South Australia never took convicts, which some South Australians will point out distinguishes them. I don't think there's a simple answer to that, and I think in some ways he felt that the culture in Adelaide, there was a culture of learning, at least in a lot of the institutions that he was involved in. And of course, he was educated at public high school. He went to Unley High and then went on to Adelaide University, and the original intent was to study medicine. But he felt, I think, that Adelaide and South Australia had a balance between strong commitment to institutions, but it not being such a large community that you had to play the class game to get to the top. Because he wasn't from the right, his parents were school teachers and administrators. They weren't of the owning class, so he felt his ability to sort of make it to be one of South Australia's greatest products was an element of pride for him, but justification that such a thing could happen in that society.
You mentioned Unley High. In fact, Unley Primary School actually educated someone who went on, a person of Indian family, to be the president of the Royal Society of London. Oh. Maybe it's interesting that Mark Oliphant came from a smaller city and, like Cambridge, just the right size.
Yeah, just the right size, where perhaps you didn't have to work so hard or break down so many non-merit-based barriers to be heard and recognised. I think that was certainly part of it. That was certainly part of his theory, and it was part of his theory about coming to Canberra too.
Yeah, and that's why the Academy of Science is good to be in a place like Canberra.
Excellent.
More intimate.
Yes, more intimate, less noise to compete with, certainly at the time it was founded, but still, that's the case. And a place where important national institutions ought to be, because it's the national capital.
My final question, I find it a struggle talking to younger people about some of the things we've discussed, the Academy, but especially the great scientists of this country. And what would you say, really, to, say, a hall full of young people about why Mark Oliphant is so significant and why they should think about him and his place in Australian history?
Well, I think to appeal to not only young minds, but perhaps people who haven't engaged in the history of science, even casually, not even as a discipline of study. I think it's about bringing to the surface elements of what we might take for granted now in the world or in Australian society, explaining why these things weren't always the case. There wasn't always penicillin, there weren't always nuclear weapons, there weren't always microwave ovens. But linking things that people know and have a strong understanding and affinity for in their own lives with the discovery that led to these realities in our lives and the great minds behind that. And when we think of any eminent people in our society and culture or heroes, linking achievements back to personalities is a natural thread, but somehow in science we don't do it as well as perhaps the sporting community does or even the historical community does, in terms of linking back the realities of our federation to the founding fathers, and I'm sorry, they were all male, to Australian Federation, bearing in mind that Mark was born in the era of Australian Federation. Other disciplines tend to do it better, and I think people like to and feel it easy to latch on to the stories of people and individuals as an avenue to understanding the importance of their discoveries. So when I talk to people who don't know who Mark Oliphant is, I might have casually dropped in conversation, because I don't have the surname, that I'm related to him, and they ask what he did, I say, well, have you got a microwave oven? Because the cavity magnetron, which makes every microwave oven work, was an invention of Mark's team at Birmingham University when he was Professor of Physics there, but more importantly was invented as a tool for helping the Allies to win the war against the Axis powers, because it's at the centre of microwave radar, which allowed you to take something that used to be housed in a building and put it in the nose of an aircraft. And those sorts of stories get people excited, and the story of the story of how the atomic bomb came about is another one which people find fascinating, even though it's not one that my grandfather was universally or without conflict proud of.
And it's time we remembered those things.
It is, I think. It's time we remembered and felt prouder of those things as Australians.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robyn. Good to talk.